I'm Margaret Brennan in Washington, and this week on Face the Nation, President Trump's tariff threats rattle allies and adversaries alike. Plus, the latest on the administration's immigration crackdown. After a whiplash week of on-again, off-again tariffs, the Trump trade war is entering a new phase as the president steps up his threats against America's neighbors.
We don't need trees from Canada. We don't need cars from Canada. We don't need energy from Canada. We don't need anything from Canada.
And acknowledges the possibility of economic disruption.
There could be some disturbance, a little bit of disturbance.
The administration says it hopes the tariffs will pressure Canada and Mexico to stop the flow of fentanyl and illegal migrants into the U.S. We'll ask Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem if it's working, and we'll get the latest on the president's mass deportation mission. Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman, will also be here. We'll ask her about the costs and consequences of the growing trade war. Plus, with just days to go before a possible government shutdown, lawmakers unveil a new bill to avoid it. We'll hear from the co-chairs of the Congressional Problem Solvers Caucus, Pennsylvania Republican Brian Fitzpatrick and New York Democrat Tom Suozzi. Finally, Russia expert Fiona Hill, who served as a top National Security Council official during the first Trump administration, joins us to discuss Trump's diplomatic pivot on Ukraine. It's all just ahead on Face the Nation. Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. We begin this morning with the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem. Madam Secretary, good to have you in person. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I want to dive right into this trade war. The justification President Trump invoked these tariffs under had to do with fentanyl. Mexico's president said Thursday that Customs and Border Protection figures show seizures of fentanyl on the southern border have dropped over the past year. She claimed they plummeted 75% in the past 6 months. Doesn't that show the existing system is working?
We've seen incredible progress as far as what we've been able to stop at the southern border since President Trump has taken office. And I think that progress can be built on. These partnerships that we have in going after traffickers, cartels, the drug trade, and also human trafficking can be even stronger and built on in the future. That's one of the things we've been asking for in specific to the Mexican government is how can we work better together to make sure we not only have the enforcement mission at the border, but south of the border and make sure we're going after these cartels. You've seen the president name them as terrorist organizations, and Canada just recently is starting to allow us to access some of their criminal background histories that we need in order to know who's coming across our border and what they're bringing. So because of his strong stance on tariffs, we're seeing them wanting to be better partners with us to keep our people safe.
So Canada's Prime Minister said it's totally false to claim Canada's unwilling to fight fentanyl. You just indicated they're willing to do more here. He pointed to CBP data that showed a 97% drop in fentanyl seizures from January compared to December, a near zero low, he said. Yeah, is the data accurate?
The data is getting better. And I would say in the conversations that I've had this week with Canadian officials, they were hoping to avoid the tariffs and had a lot of conversations, but not a lot of action. So this is the hope, is that the fact that President Trump has said something and now has enforced consequences, we really are hoping for even better partnerships. We need access to their criminal background system so that we know when someone crosses that northern border, who they are, why they're in our country, and who they may be partnering with. We also need them to work with us on identifying packages, technology investments. Canada has said they will do that. We just want to see them actually do it. In the past, promises have been made by both Mexico and Canada that they didn't follow through on. Their naming of a fentanyl czar in Canada is important. That's great. Now let's see really what happens. President Trump's been strong, and I think that's why you've seen the data going our direction. But boy, every day people in this country are dying of overdoses, and I don't want any more families to have to deal with that tragedy if it can be avoided and we can have a stronger relationship. So
you just gave specific examples of what Canada and Mexico can do, presumably to avoid the tariffs that are now being pushed off till April 2nd. The Commerce Secretary said in another Network, if fentanyl ends, I think these will come off. But if fentanyl does not end, or he's uncertain about it, meaning the president, they will stay on until he's comfortable. Is it that general, or are these very specific things that you can kind of go through and check to avoid these tariffs?
Yeah, I've had very specific conversations with Canadian officials and Mexican officials on what they can do. So they know what they can do to help avoid tariffs in the future and what we're expecting of them. If they do it, we shall see. We all recognize that each one of these leaders has political environments in their home countries as well, but President Trump means business, and he meant it when he ran to be president of the United States again, and since he's taken office, that he will put America first. And every day in this country, we have seen over the last several years violence and unsafe streets and cities, and people lose their children and grandchildren. And he's taking action to make sure that we're cleaning up the mess that Joe Biden left behind, and that we have a much safer country and where Americans can look forward to the future.
So this is not just leverage to get a better free trade deal. This is not just because President Trump truly believes that tariffs are the heart of his economic policy.
Right.
You're saying this really is about fentanyl?
It really is about fentanyl. It really is. And I think the president obviously wants a strong economy, obviously wants better trade deals as well. But this is about fentanyl and what we can do to stop the cartels from partnering with Chinese officials, laundering money, and bringing a poison into our country that is specifically designed to kill the next generation. I think a lot of people don't understand the strategy of these enemies of the United States and what they're utilizing. They are bringing this in not just to make money. They're bringing it in here to kill Americans. And it's time that we stand up for the people that live here and make sure that we're stopping this war against our children.
I want to ask you, border crossings, they're at a 25-year low.
They are. It's fantastic.
There are 6,000 U.S. military personnel working at the border now. That number could go up to 9,000 by the end of the month. How long do you have to keep them there if the numbers are already dropping like this?
You know, we'll continue the partnership with the Department of Defense, but also we've got partnerships with Commerce, with the Attorney General's office. You know, we're working every day with the Secretary of State. We'll keep them there until that border is completely secure, and we see all-time record lows of encounters. Our Border Patrol is doing fantastic work, but we're going to keep them there till the whole world gets the message that this isn't Joe Biden's world anymore. This is President Donald Trump's country, where we have a border, where we have laws, and it applies equally to everybody. I think that is what is so refreshing, is that we're not picking and choosing winners and losers anymore. Americans have to live by the law. So do those who come to this country. You have to come here legally, or there will be consequences.
Let me ask you about what's happening internally when it comes to, migration. The administration has revived this policy of detaining migrant families, parents with children, in ICE detention centers. Bush did it, Obama did it, Biden did not. Have you seen these Texas facilities where children are being held with their parents? Are you comfortable with it personally?
We've got detention facilities across the country, and there's specific ones that are built specifically for families if they are detained. But remember, everybody has an option. They have an option to be here legally or illegally, and they can self-deport as well. We've set up a system and a website where people who are here illegally right now can register, and they can choose to go home on their own and keep their families united. Well, the kids do have a choice. If they have parents, they make a choice to keep their families together if they want to, or not. If parents make a decision to leave their children behind, then that's a choice that they made as a family. And we need to remember that when Americans break the law and they have consequences or face a situation, they're separated from their families too. I don't believe we should prioritize people from other countries above Americans.
But when it comes to reviving the policy of separating families from their children at the border,
we're actually reviving it.
That's what I want to ask you.
President Biden didn't follow the law. He didn't follow the law in the fact that it's always been equally applied until his administration. And then he made decisions to ignore federal law in how he handled immigration and enforcement within our borders. And so today we're expanding our team at ICE, and we're going to have an acting director in Todd Lyons, who has a long history with Tom Homan. They have worked together to build on these enforcement operations. So we're also naming a deputy secretary in Madison Sheehan that was going to be another expansion of this team. They've done incredible work cleaning up our communities and making them safer. Adding more people to the team with Todd and with Madison is going to allow us to partner with local law enforcement officials to make sure that we truly are following through on enforcing the law. And if you break our law, then there's going to be consequences.
So you want the number of deportations to tick up?
I do, absolutely.
So,
but people, remember, they have an option to go home on their own.
Yeah.
We are giving them that opportunity to do that, and we will help facilitate that. And if they don't, and they end up coming into our enforcement opportunities that we have in front of us, they may never get the chance to come back. So people need to remember, if they self-deport, they will have an opportunity to come back to this country legally.
But you have a capacity issue right now in terms of just beds to put people in when you detain them. Are you going to open up military facilities like Fort Bliss?
There is, yes, a plan to use the facilities at Fort Bliss for detention facilities, but also we need to remember to ask, Congress needs to continue through with funding that this administration has asked for. We clearly have a CR discussion in front of us this week. We have a reconciliation discussion. That reconciliation bill needs to happen. We have just weeks before we are out of the funds to continue the operations that we have. And even everywhere I've been in this country out there, looking at what President Trump has done on immigration and border enforcement, the people that I meet are saying thank you. Thank you for getting these terrorists out of the country. He has deported, in just 1 month,
have you deported
22
terrorists?
known and terrorists on the terrorist watch list are out of this country now. We have almost 700 gang members that have been deported out of the country in just a month. And
which have been redefined as foreign terrorist organizations by the Trump administration.
281 specific TDA members, which we know are the worst of the worst, have been taken out of this country. So everyone that has a story like Laken Riley's family or Jocelyn's family, they're extremely grateful that won't be perpetuated amongst other families in other states.
I want to ask you, you said that you have found leakers within DHS and you're going to prosecute them. Back on February 9th, you tweeted, "The FBI is so corrupt. We'll work with any and every agency to stop leaks." Were you wrong then to blame the FBI if the leaks were from within DHS?
No, I think there's leakers all over throughout this government. I think that everybody needs to be, I think these, in DHS specifically, these two, were leaking our enforcement operations that we had planned and we're going to conduct in several cities, and expose law enforcement to vulnerabilities, to those ops being jeopardized to where their lives would be in danger. So they will be prosecuted, and they could face up to 10 years in federal prison because they did that. Anyone who is leaking information outside of how something is planned for the safety of those law enforcement officers needs to be held accountable for that.
And you're going to continue these polygraphing
absolutely
of employees?
The authorities that I have under the Department of Homeland Security are broad and extensive, and I plan to use every single one of them to make sure that we're following the law, that we are following the procedures in place to keep people safe, and that we're making sure we're following through on what President Trump has promised, that he's going to make America safe again.
Madam Secretary, thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back in 1 minute. Stay with us. Canadian officials are warning of retaliation against the U.S. over President Trump's tariff threats. Senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe has the latest from Ottawa.
Well, Margaret, President Trump is now threatening tariffs on Canadian dairy and lumber exports, even as he holds off on the broader tariffs on goods covered by the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement until at least early April. This has mostly been a war of words so far, rather than a war over the wallet. But that's going to change in the coming day, as Ontario is now threatening to tariff electricity it wires to Minnesota, Michigan, and New York.
I'm going to put a 25% tariff on the electricity, the 1.5 million homes and businesses, as of Monday, until President Trump drops these tariffs. He has to understand that he can't attack our country economically and expect us to roll over.
It's not entirely clear how the cost of those tariffs would be passed on to American households. Now, we're here in Ottawa today because amid the tariff war, there's also a Canadian transfer of power underway. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced in January he would be stepping down after nearly a decade. His ruling Liberal Party today anoints his successor. It's a race between Mark Carney, an economist and the former head of the Banks of Canada and Britain, and Chrystia Freeland, a former Trudeau deputy. Whoever wins the race, Margaret, becomes Prime Minister and has to deal with President Trump and the tariff war.
That was our Ed O'Keefe in Ottawa. We're joined now by Canada's ambassador to the United States, Kirsten Hillman. Ambassador, it's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Margaret.
You just heard the Homeland Security Secretary say there are conversations with your government. She seemed optimistic that there would be follow through on fentanyl. Does that make you think this threat of tariffs on April 2nd is something that can be managed and avoided?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think that we are in a very good place in our discussions with the U.S. administration on fentanyl. We have invested a lot of new resources. We have given our law enforcement new powers, and we have responded to the requests of the Trump administration with respect to cooperative effects in getting at the sources. So the organized crime, the precursors coming from China. And we've had some really, really good discussions. So we're optimistic. And I just would say, and I think it's important for your viewers to know, fentanyl is a very serious problem in Canada too. On some days, we have more deaths per capita than you have here in the United States. So we take this very seriously. It is not a big issue between our two countries. Less than 1% of the fentanyl that is seized in the United States is coming from Canada. But every ounce can kill families and people. So we're taking it very seriously.
But you are indulging the premise that that is the actual motivation for the tariffs rather than leverage for a free trade deal or just because President Trump believes in them?
Well, I think that this set of tariffs, the 25 and 10% set of tariffs, we have been told repeatedly that it is about fentanyl and security at the border. There are other tariffs that have been discussed, and the president has raised other issues as motivations for other tariffs, reciprocity and fairness, and maybe some changes that he'd like to see to our USMCA, our trade agreement. So those conversations are going to happen as well.
So President Trump said Friday he may put tariffs on Canadian lumber and dairy Monday or Tuesday. Here's what he said. Take a listen.
Canada has been ripping us off for years on tariffs for lumber and for dairy products. 250%, nobody ever talks about that. 250% tariff, which is taking advantage of our farmers, so that's not going to happen anymore. They'll be met with the exact same tariff unless they drop it, and that's what reciprocal means.
On another network, the Commerce Secretary said no, that's actually on hold till April 2nd. It's confusing for us to follow this along. Is the clarity with the two governments any better?
We are in active discussions with Secretary Lutnick, and those discussions are heading towards April 2nd. And that, I think, we are putting our energy in the substantive discussions that we are having with the Secretary, with USTR, with the White House. That is, I guess, how I can answer that question. The president does have a variety of concerns, and I think also sees tariffs as a tool for a variety of policy objectives. But really, all we can do is focus on the real work at hand, which is to get at these issues. Like, for example, lumber. Canada doesn't have a tariff on lumber. It's zero. U.S. lumber can come into Canada duty-free. On dairy, the U.S. sells 3 times as much dairy into Canada as we sell into the United States. So what's more, I think, productive for us is to talk about the facts around the actual trading relationship and try and get at where the concerns are.
But Canada does put a tariff as high as 241% on dairy imports, but it's a sliding scale that only kicks in at a certain level, and that's under the free trade deal.
That's right, and it's like the United States. In agriculture, the United States is the same. In sugar and dairy, you allow a certain amount of product in, and then after that level is hit, you put restraints in on imports. And we do the same to protect our farmers and families and small family farms that need to be sure that they can have a bit of the market.
So there was this 50-minute phone call Wednesday with the Vice President, the Commerce Secretary, and President Trump with your Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Afterwards, the president posted that Trudeau was unable to tell him when the election was taking place, which made him curious, like, quote, what's going on here? I then realized he's trying to use this issue to stay in power. Do you think this is like a personal issue here? Do you think it'll change when your leadership changes?
It's hard for me to say. I think that the Prime Minister and the President, Prime Minister Trudeau and the President, they've done big things together, right? They did renegotiate NAFTA together, right? They have a long history. They did good things together. They managed our 6,000, practically 6,000-mile border during COVID very successfully, in my opinion. So it's a long relationship and has had many phases to it. We will have a new Prime Minister this week. Today, the Liberal Party will elect a new leader. That new leader will be sworn in the coming days, and that person will become Canada's Prime Minister. Those are facts that are not going to change.
Do you think it will stop the vows from the president to talk about threatening to annex Canada?
You know, I guess
what
I can, I'm not sure what that is. What I can say is that Canadians don't really appreciate it. They're getting a little bit frustrated with that kind of rhetoric. But more importantly, Canadians are frustrated with our neighbors, you know, the country that we feel closest to, the country that is partners, allies, often family, that we've gone to war with, that we've died with, that we come to each other's aid. Most recently in LA, but obviously 9/11. You've come to our aid over the years so many times. And we feel, Canadians feel, under attack, under economic attack. And that is causing some challenges for sure across Canadian society. I think our new Prime Minister, when that person comes in, will prioritize trying to have a good and healthy and productive relationship with the President. I am sure that that's going to be possible. Relationships go both ways, but I know that on our side, that's going to be a priority.
Ambassador, thank you for joining us. And we'll be right back with a lot more Face the Nation. Stay with us. We turn now to another front in President Trump's trade war, and that's China. Foreign correspondent Anna Coren is in Beijing with the latest.
A tone of defiance from Beijing this week, with China preparing for a protracted trade war with the United States, which it maintains will have no winners. It announced retaliatory tariffs on US agricultural products and targeted 25 American companies in response to the now 20% blanket tariffs President Trump placed on all Chinese goods. In a press conference on the sidelines of the National People's Congress, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said the country would fight back despite economic challenges at home. And without naming President Trump, he accused the US of being duplicitous in its relationship with China, saying, no country should expect to suppress and contain China on one hand, while maintaining good relations with China on the other. Well, earlier this week, his ministry used particularly aggressive language, stating, if war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. While there's no doubt a trade war will hurt China's economy, it's had 6 years to prepare for this since the trade war began in 2018. And Margaret, despite being open to negotiations, its decision to opt for defiance rather than flattery is a sign China won't back down.
Anna Coren in Beijing. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're joined now by the co-chairs of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. Pennsylvania Republican Brian Fitzpatrick represents a district that was narrowly carried by Kamala Harris. And New York Democrat Tom Suozzi represents a district that went for President Trump. So you all have to find the middle. And that brings you together and brings you here today. It's good to see in a bipartisan fashion this conversation take place. But I want to start with you, Congressman Fitzpatrick. There is this potential government shutdown looming March the 14th. Speaker Johnson says there's going to be a vote on Tuesday. Will Republicans be able to pass this on party lines, or do you need Democratic votes?
Well, that remains to be seen. You know, the text was just released yesterday, compliant with the 72-hour rule before a vote. We're still digging through it. Like most bills, there's some good in there, there's some not so good in there, and we got to make an aggregate decision. I will say, you know, Tom and I are friends. We came in together. We obviously co-chair this bipartisan group together. And we do lament the fact of any single party bill. The construct in this country is if you get 218 votes, you get everything. And if you get 217 votes, you get nothing. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So the reason that we do what we do is we want two-party solutions, including on the CR. So it remains to be seen whether the votes are there or not. But I think we're really going to be learning over the next 24 hours what's in it and what's not in it.
So you haven't decided your vote?
Correct.
What about you, Congressman Suozzi? Because Leader Jeffries initially said in a letter Democrats cannot back it. You have the text. Are you a no?
Right now, I'm a no. I mean, there's been no outreach on a bipartisan basis. What Brian and I are trying to do in this environment, you can imagine, is not too easy. Yeah. Everything's very fractured. Everything's very divisive. And to overcome that requires trust building and requires people to work together. In the case of the CR, there's been offers to negotiate, and there's been very little negotiated. It's kind of been a my way or the highway type of thing. And I think that's going to go on for a while. I think that the leadership is going to try and do my way or the highway for a while, and then at some point they're going to need Democratic votes, and then people will start negotiating. A while meaning we could be staring down a shutdown March 14th?
Well, we'll find out on Tuesday or Wednesday. I believe the government funding runs out at the end of the week. Yeah. We're scheduled to end votes on Wednesday. Oftentimes that does not happen during weeks like this. But it's incumbent upon every legislator to read the text and to make an aggregate decision. Does the good outweigh the bad? We never want to shut the government down. That's why I think we need no budget, no pay. If you cut legislators' funding off, if they don't pass a CR or a budget, I think you'll have a much different outcome. So people need to put their money where their mouth is.
Right now, the Republicans are counting on all the Republicans in the House to stick together to pass this through the House with no Democratic votes. That's what they're counting on. That's why they've conducted themselves this way. Then it goes to the Senate. In the Senate, you need 60 votes. You don't have 60 votes with the Senate Republicans. So it's going to become a challenge for the Senate Republicans and the Senate Democrats to decide who's going to get blamed for this thing. And wouldn't it be better if we all just worked together to try and find common ground? This is not normal what we're doing. The idea of a full year continuing resolution is not the normal process. And there's a lot of bad stuff that I see in this bill that I don't like.
And I will add, Margaret, I've lived through government shutdowns as an FBI agent, and it's horrific. Title III wiretaps get shut down. Surveillance teams get shut down. It has massive implications that most people don't realize. You never, ever want to shut the government down. It should never happen. And it's a symptom of a broken system that we're even talking about this.
Let me follow up with you on that. You are the only FBI agent who now turned congressman. On Monday, the top agent at the New York office, James Dennehy, said he was forced out of his job due to clashes with Justice Department officials over directives. He had been supportive of bureau leaders who resisted turning over the names of those agents assigned to carry out investigations related to January the 6th. 2021. Are you concerned about all this political pressure?
I'm very concerned. I'm a huge defender and supporter of the Bureau. It was the best job I ever had in my life, the most honorable job I've ever had in my life, keeping America safe. And I care very much about the agent population and the professional support staff that work there. They are tremendous people. They are completely nonpartisan. In 14 years in the FBI, I never heard any political talk whatsoever, which is pretty remarkable. So
that directly contradicts what the Homeland Security Secretary said at the top of this program when she went at the FBI.
Well, there have been problems at the top. I want to differentiate. So there have been problems on the 7th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building that they did politicize things like people like Jim Comey, for example, who tweet out, to vote single party during an election. You can't do that as an FBI director. That's terrible. He did it as a former director, but it undermines everything he did leading up to that point. The FBI needs to be completely nonpartisan, completely apolitical. Personally, I think that part of the polygraph testing that comes in, so when you're an agent coming through the process, you get tested on drug history, foreign contacts, financial vulnerabilities. They also ought to test political bias as well, just to give the public the assurance that people are coming into the Bureau checking their politics at the door.
This all comes down to a busting of norms. And things that we've been used to for years are all trying to be disrupted. And I think in some ways very dangerously. We can't see this politicization of the FBI. It's a dangerous thing for our country. Are you to talk to the FBI director about any of this?
Absolutely.
About the firings of the political pressure?
Director Patel worked on our committee. He was a staffer on the House Intelligence Committee, which I sit. And I look forward to having a conversation with him.
Congressman Suozzi, illegal border crossings, as we just discussed, they are at a historic low. President Trump made that point when he was addressing Congress this week. Was he right that he didn't need to wait for Congress, that it was really messaging from the White House beyond?
Well, obviously, we've seen a reduction in crossings. We saw it under the end of the Biden administration as well after he did his executive order to say no asylum applications in between the ports of entry. But we need to make it permanent law. And Congress has not done its job for 30 years. So we need to secure the border. We need to fix the broken asylum system, and we need to treat people like human beings by fixing our legal immigration system.
Do you have an opening to do any of that, though? The two of you together.
I was working on this before I became the co-chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus for about a year with a guy named Morgan Luttrell from Texas, very conservative, former Navy SEAL guy, talking about the details, trying to build a coalition of business, badges, and the Bible to work together to support an effort like this. Now, Brian and I, as co-chairs of the Problem Solvers Caucus, are taking those efforts and others and and we have a working group as well, to say as soon as that opening arises, we're ready to make a deal.
I know, but you guys are talking about you can't even agree to keep the lights on, right?
Okay, but
you're talking about really hard, substantive
Well, what's going to
things.
happen is the Homeland Security is going to need money. They're spending money like crazy, and this CR is not going to fix the problem. And
That's going to go to reconciliation, party line vote.
You can't
right?
fix everything through reconciliation, and you're going to need, and you certainly can't fix asylum, and you certainly can't fix the Dreamers and a whole bunch of other stuff through reconciliation. There's going to be an opening that's going to come when they need Democratic votes. And my argument to my Democratic colleagues is we should be looking to finally fix this broken immigration system once and for all. Secure the border, fix asylum, Dreamers, farm workers, essential workers, and other people that we need to keep our economy going.
If I may add, one of the reasons why I'm so excited about Tom being the co-chair is he shares my passion and the passion of so many people about this issue, that there is a border security piece and there is an immigration piece. And we're a country of immigrants. All of our families came in to this country through other places, Italy, Ireland.
My father was born in Italy.
Yeah.
And for Brennan and Fitzpatrick, I got Irish as well.
And you know, that's the huge advantage that we have over our adversaries, is we have an endless supply of brilliant people coming into this country. Nobody wants to move to Russia or China or North Korea or Iran. Everybody wants to come here. That's a huge economic advantage. It's a huge national security advantage. So we can combine border security and the rule of law with bringing the best and brightest people into this country, and also people that are truly fleeing oppression. That's what America is about.
Margaret, every problem we face in our country is complicated. You know this as well as anybody. Everything's complicated. You can't, why don't you just? There's no why don't you just anything. Anybody who says that doesn't know what
That's
they're
an
talking
entire
about.
political campaign.
Right.
Why don't you just?
Right, which doesn't make sense. And so what you need is people who may disagree with each other on certain issues to sit across from each other and say, well, I think this, well, I think that, well, how about this, well, how about that? And you try and find a compromise somewhere in the middle. Compromise is not a dirty word. And we have got to figure out how to start moving our country forward, not with this all my way or the highway, you guys are no good because you're one of those. No, you're one of those.
Right.
That's not working for our country. People want us to work together to solve problems.
Let me ask you, Congressman Fitzpatrick, I know you feel very strongly about supporting Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Ben Hodges, who's a retired general who commanded U.S. Army Europe, said he's having a hard time understanding how withholding intelligence and military support from Ukraine advances strategic interests or helps make America great. Can you explain that?
Well, I will say this. We're going to get a full briefing on this coming week, but I will say this. Key in on what's not being said here. What kind of intelligence and who can't share it, right? So what I suspect, and I will get confirmation of this next week, is that it's the over-the-horizon intelligence striking into Russian territory.
It's also satellite.
Possibly. But second,
Maxar Technologies
we
came out
have
yesterday and
seamless
said that.
intelligence sharing with the UK, to give you one example. There's no restriction on the UK sharing that intelligence with Ukraine. So what I suspect is happening here, and I could be proven wrong, is that this is an escalate to de-escalate tactic by the administration to bring these parties to the table and to come to a conclusion, a just conclusion, which means success and victory for Ukraine. And I want to emphasize that. And I get asked, well, what does that mean?
Yep.
What victory means for me is Vladimir Putin regrets his decision to invade Ukraine, that he wishes he did not do that. And that's really going to be the test here, right? Because if we reward dictators for invading sovereign, freedom-loving democracies, we are sending a message to every other dictator and aspiring dictator across this planet that if you do that, you will be rewarded. That cannot be the message coming out of this.
Trump has been wrong in the way he's handled this. I want to give Brian credit as co-chair of the Ukrainian caucus for standing up and saying you cannot reward a dictator. Zelensky was elected by 73% of the Ukrainian population in a free and fair election as dictated by the European Commission that oversees free and fair elections. Putin is the dictator. Putin invaded. Zelensky is democratically elected. We cannot reward the guy responsible for murdering, for kidnapping, for raping, for all the awful things that have happened to the Ukrainian people. We all need to stand up for the Ukrainian people.
Well, we know that the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and President Trump's envoy are all meeting with Ukrainian officials Tuesday. One of the things that I took note of, Congressman Fitzpatrick, you tweeted that you have an outcome-determinative number of members of the U.S. Congress who are ready, willing, and able to do whatever it takes to prevent Putin from being rewarded. That sounds like you are threatening leverage with votes. How would you use it?
It's not a threat. What this is us making very clear that we view this issue to be existential to world peace. These are the lessons of World War II. When we had, when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, and you had leaders, including Neville Chamberlain and many other leaders around the world, saying it's not our problem, we don't want to provoke, we don't want to escalate, and a problem that could have been nipped in the bud early, because it was not, turned out to be the costliest and deadliest war in world history, where we had to send our our youth in our country to fight on Omaha Beach. We should never get to that point. We should learn from the lessons of history. These dictators want to relitigate the outcome of World War II. In World War II, freedom won over dictatorships. They want to relitigate that. So we just have to be mindful of history and how we approach this.
And if Putin gets away with this, just because Ukraine's a smaller country, think about Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia and Moldova, and think about Poland.
Right.
They're all next, and we have to stand up against this.
And Putin has said that. He's telegraphed this punch.
Right. Well, President Trump says that it's all different when he's in charge. But Congressman, I need to ask you before you go, because of the district and the unique characteristics of it, the one you represent, earlier this week, we saw guidance from the chair of the National Republican Congressional Committee urging members to hold virtual town halls, suggesting that holding them in person was not a good idea. Will you still hold town halls with your constituents?
Yeah, we communicate.
Because some have gotten quite heated recently.
Oh, I know. No, I think every member needs to find the best way to communicate with their constituents, and there's a number of ways to do that. I think what Chairman Hudson's referring to are the what's turning out to be a circus, a three-ring circus, where you go to a high school gymnasium, the protesters show up, they hold signs up, and you have legitimate concerns from some other people that are never heard because they're getting shouted down by people that are there to make a spectacle, oftentimes that are funded by some of these dark money groups. So it's about communicating to your constituents in a way that you can get your message out, that you can hear their concerns, and every single district does it different, depending on where they're at.
You, Congressman Suozzi, during the address to Congress this week, you did see the Texas Democrat, Congressman Green, be disruptive. He was pulled out of the chamber because of that. Later censured with the votes of 9 Democrats, including yourself, and 214 Republicans. Why did you take that vote against a fellow Democrat?
Because if it was a Republican doing the same thing to a Democratic president, I would have voted for that as well. And the bottom line is it was a strategic mistake on our behalf as well. Because instead of talking about Social Security cuts and talking about Medicaid cuts and talking about Medicare cuts and talking about the things that the president said in his speech that we disagree with, especially things like Ukraine or firing people in these different departments that make no sense whatsoever, we instead focused too much time on disruptive behavior.
Yeah.
And the conduct of the Democrats. That was a strategic mistake, as well as something that just is not appropriate for the decorum of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Was the message from Democratic leadership not clear then?
I think that it was pretty clear. I understood a clear message. Let's not make the story about us. Let's make the story about what President Trump says and how we disagree with it. And we squandered that opportunity.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for doing this in a bipartisan fashion as well. We'll be right back. Russia stepped up its aerial attacks on Ukraine following the Trump administration's suspension of intelligence sharing and military equipment. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Moscow has carried out hundreds of attacks using ballistic missiles and drones. For more now, we're joined by Fiona Hill. She is a senior fellow at Brookings, and during the first Trump administration, she was the senior director for European and Russian affairs on the National Security Council. Good to have you back.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret.
So, the U.S. pauses of lethal intelligence sharing, including targeting data for U.S.-provided weapons like HIMARS. We also know it extends to satellite imagery, which is no longer being shared with Ukraine. What's the practical impact of that and the military freeze?
Well, I think we can see the impact. It's certainly, on the one hand, emboldened Russia to really step up the attacks. And it's also not just blindsided, but also partially blinded Ukraine. I mean, we heard from the previous segment that there's still some sharing with allies like the United Kingdom, of course, which is part of the Five Eyes sharing with the United States. But But frankly, none of the other allies, including the UK, have the same access to satellite imagery as the United States does. So even if there is, some sharing, not much restrictions, this certainly has an impact. And frankly, I think it's going to be an impetus to other allies to start stepping up their own capabilities and questioning themselves about the virtues of sharing with the United States. I mean, this is a two-way street. We have to remember that other countries also share pretty vital information with the United States, even if the scale is not quite the same.
Canada, the UK, Australia, among those who do so. You think they will essentially punish the US by not sharing intelligence?
I'm not sure whether it's punishment, but it'll be a lot of questioning about what actually happens with this. Because if you're bundling together intelligence, and then effectively the United States is putting restrictions on that, was that pre-discussed with our Five Eyes allies, for example, or with other allies, particularly in the midst of basically a conflict that is, as we've heard over and over again, the largest land war in Europe since World War II. I mean, this is really unprecedented in terms of the actions of the United States in this regard, because it's not just affecting Ukraine. Again, it's having knock-on effects for all of our other allies who are directly affected, all of our European allies that are directly affected by this conflict.
So President Trump said on Friday, when he was asked if this uptick in Putin's bombing was directly related to the U.S. halt. Here's what he said.
I actually think he's doing what anybody else would do. I think he wants to get it stopped and settled, and I think he's hitting them harder than he's been hitting them. And I think probably anybody in that position would be doing that right now.
Yet earlier in the day, the president had posted on social media he was considering possibly putting sanctions on Russia. That's a contradiction. What do you make of what he said?
I make of it exactly what he said. I mean, he's actually obviously putting himself in the shoes of Vladimir Putin and saying that if I were the aggressor, that's exactly what I would be doing if I wanted to make Ukraine capitulate. So, I mean, yeah, he called it as it is. I don't believe what he said for a second about the sanctions. I believe more what he just said there in the Oval Office, sitting behind, the Resolute desk. I mean, I think that's what you can take away from this. He
believe the president and when he says
I think
things.
you should. Yeah, I mean, he's the president of the United States, and he made it crystal clear, I think. And he sees, obviously, the Ukrainians, and he said that in the Oval Office during the meeting with President Zelensky, that he sees them on the back foot as losing, and he's basically telling them that they have to capitulate. Very clear.
You don't have the cards was the line he kept using.
That's
then.
right.
So I know you were at the Council on Foreign Relations this week, as was I. I had an interview with Trump's envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. And when we were discussing the president's decision to cut off Ukraine, he said Ukrainians brought it on themselves. And the decision was like, quote, hitting a mule with a 2x4 across the nose. You got their attention. It's quite a statement, comparing our ally to a farm animal here that needed to be beaten. Do you think it was right to say the Ukrainian government, though, was just not getting it?
Well, what they weren't getting is really what President Trump wanted directly from them, which was obviously to have President Zelensky make a personal agreement with him in the Oval Office in front of all the cameras to thank him profusely for all the aid that was already provided to Ukraine over successive administrations now, and basically to sign a deal on rare earths, minerals, and then basically leave immediately after that. And clearly, President Zelensky didn't really get that message. And I think there's a very important element here. In diplomacy, you really should not only be speaking in your native language. And I think that there was a lot of this was lost in translation. First of all, President Zelensky didn't fully understand that this agreement was just purely with President Trump. And you may remember, if we all go back and watch that, I watched it many times just to try to figure out exactly where things had gone wrong. There were multiple points. But there was one point when President Zelensky basically said, look, we had deals with your previous presidents, basically with Obama and Biden. And President Trump immediately dismissed all of that and basically said those deals were not worth the paper they were written on or the commitments that were made because they were weak and it wasn't me. And President Zelensky didn't quite follow all of this because, like the rest of our allies, he actually thinks that commitments made by the United States are supposed to hold over successive administrations. And what we learned there and what he learned there was that is not the case. You're essentially going to have to make a new commitment with President Trump. It's a personal commitment, and that was what he was being told, and he didn't fully understand. And I think in future, when the Ukrainians are meeting with the Americans, they ought to have translators with them, because as good as President Zelensky's English is, there's two things that he's missing there. He doesn't quite understand the way that President Trump operates, although I think he's probably got the message now, but he doesn't always understand the nuances. And I would also think that our side, on the United States side, could do with some interpretation as well, coming also from President Zelensky. So my advice to President Zelensky and to the team around President Trump is use interpreters. That's what they're there for.
And your own government's interpreters.
That's absolutely right. Your own government's interpreters, not, because you actually asked that question, whose interpreters were used, and General Keller couldn't answer the question.
Right, for Steve Witkoff, who met with Putin for 3.5 hours.
Correct.
Europe seems to be taking these threats seriously and looking at an alternative to the American nuclear deterrent and umbrella. Does that mean the transatlantic alliance is gone?
Well, it doesn't mean that it's gone, but there's a bit of a kind of a one-sided attempt to rupture it here on the part of the United States. I was also at the Munich Security Conference. I heard Vice President Vance's speech. I was standing next to a couple of very prominent Europeans who were completely in shock. Yeah. And immediately after that, as you well know, there were many statements coming out of Germany, as well as countries like Sweden, basically asking whether the United States could be trusted on nuclear weapons. And we have to remember that Ukraine had nuclear weapons that it gave up.
And they gave them up.
That's correct.
With the promise of a security guarantee that was not delivered on.
Correct.
Fiona Hill, thank you. We'll be back. Thanks. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.